Welcome to Everyday Nonviolence. This podcast is produced by Friends for a Nonviolent World, or FNVW. FNVW works to promote and create peace and justice in our community by using the principles and practices of nonviolence to transform conflict and to address the root causes of violence. The Everyday Nonviolence podcast highlights people whose stories deepen our understanding of violence and whose lives demonstrate the many ways nonviolence can promote healing and social change.
Hello, I'm Jarren Dean, hosting this episode of Everyday Nonviolence. I'm excited to speak with two writers whose work has been heavily influenced by their families' histories, including their experience with violence and discrimination. Stanley Kusunoki and Kao Kalia, thank you so much for taking time from your busy schedules to join me. Stan, we're going to get started with you. Could you kick us off by telling us a bit about your family's story?
Well, I am a third-generation Japanese American. After the bombing of Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt issued an order that everybody of Japanese ancestry on the West Coast, so from California all the way up to Oregon, be evacuated, which means pretty much taken out of their homes and put into prison camps because they were perceived as a threat. They were perceived as the enemy. And out of 120-odd thousand Japanese Americans, not one was ever found guilty of conspiring with the Japanese. So these were mostly American citizens. And so they were Americans. They were not Japanese by nationality. But because of the way they looked, because of their affiliation, they were considered a threat, and the wartime hysteria, as we know in current times, took hold, and we were labeled enemies, bad people, people who were doing acts against the country. And so that is the history that I was brought up in. I was not in the camps, but what happened to my parents in the camps certainly, affected my upbringing. The fact that I have a name Stanley instead of a Japanese name is sort of a way of trying to disguise me. It doesn't work when you see me, but on paper, at least I don't look like a foreigner, so to speak.
So as you were growing up, did conversations about your parents' experience play a huge role in who you were as a child and then who you've grown into? Like, was that a part of your everyday conversation, or how would you say that impacted you?
No, actually, my parents would not talk about it. There's a word in Japanese, shigatekanai. It can't be helped. Why worry about it? And so up until the day she died, my mother put a positive spin on it. Like, if it weren't for the camps, well, we would all be clustered in California. We wouldn't be spread out. We wouldn't have all these other experiences. And I'm going, but Mom, you basically lost your adolescence. She didn't want to talk about that. The only way I heard about it is New Year's is a huge deal. And so the Japanese community is fairly close-knit and fairly small. So we would have a pretty good percentage of the Twin Cities Japanese community over to our house for New Year's. And it was during one of these New Year's celebrations, there was a door that was closed. And of course, being a kid and being very curious and going, somebody who wants me to not know what's going on in there. I cracked the door, and there were these guys who were in the camps complaining about the camps. And so then I went to my parents and said, what about these camps? What's going on? Because I was thinking camps like summer camp, and they still didn't want to talk about it. And so I did a little research and found out about them. And then what got my mom to finally open up is that I was in internship at the Loft, or mentorship. It's called Asian Inroads. We were all Asians and we were writing about our experience. And so what I did is to imagine my parents as 14 and 16-year-olds in the camps and losing that really vital part. They lost high school. And so, of course, at the end, there was a reading, and my parents came to the reading. And so here I am reading my imaginings of their lives in the camps. So afterwards, my mom said, well, that was really good, but it's not exactly the way it happened. And so after that, every now and then, she would let drop a little piece of information. And I said, well, I didn't know about that. And where did that come from? And he said, oh, that was in the camps. And so she found that I could be the spokesman for her who could not voice her experience in the camps.
That's incredible. I know we'll learn more about your background and your work and how they've collided. But Kalia, let's hear a bit more about your family's experience. Can you tell us about your story?
I am Hmong American. I was born in the refugee camps of Thailand. When we learn about the Vietnam War in this country, we don't learn about the other wars across Southeast Asia, namely the secret war in Laos, or even what was happening in Cambodia. But my people, the Hmong, we were commissioned by the Central Intelligence Agency of the United States of America to fight and to die on America's behalf because the war was so unpopular here in this country. When the Americans left in 1975, they took only the highest ranking officers with them, leaving hundreds of thousands of Hmong people left to die. Knowing that there was a declaration of genocide, Gausan Pathat Lao, the leading communist paper, had declared it is necessary to extirpate down to the root the Hmong minority. My mom and dad were young. One day their schools went up in flames, and they fled because they knew that the soldiers were coming, and they were not coming with peace in their hands, but guns and bullets ready to shoot. My mom and dad met in that hot, humid jungle where bodies were strewn like fallen fruits. They somehow chose love in this time of war, and they journeyed across the Mekong River to Thailand, where I would be born. I'm a child of the refugee camps of Thailand. I came during the biggest influx of Hmong refugees into Thailand, when Thailand had decided that they did not want any more refugees flooding into their country. So they were practicing a humane deterrence policy, giving Hmong people food 3 days a week and asking us to wait out the week. I was born in a year full of healthy babies, and I was the runt of the group. Everybody thought I would die, but somehow I made it. Every time I looked at my mother, she would give me the food in her hands, the food in her mouth. My mother has 6 miscarriages after me. So it wasn't until I was 6 years old, 6.5, when my mom and dad knew that the camps were closing, that there was no more recourse for our people. When we applied for resettlement and were resettled to St. Paul, Minnesota.
Wow. Thank you for telling us. Kalia, what led you to writing as a profession? I mean, just based on that alone, I can tell you're a very powerful storyteller. What sparked that interest in writing?
You know, there's so many different ways that I can approach the question, Jarren. I was trained in the MFA workshops at Columbia University, but long before that, I sat at the feet of my elders. You know, the elders would speak because the Hmong we belong to an oral culture. A long time ago, our language was outlawed. And so we tried to hide our language into our clothing. Hmong women the world over are renowned for their embroidery, but lots of people don't know why that skill was passed down generation after generation. But it was an effort to hold safe our language. And so I grew up hearing stories. My Uncle Ju particularly would stretch out his arm and say, Menai, the hair, these are trees. The knuckles of my hands, these are the mountains that you belong to. The veins, these are the rivers that flowed far and fast. The whole of the world would come to life on the stretch of his arm. I became a writer because I saw with the passing years how that arm lost its muscle, how the skin began to sag, how it grew dry like paper. And I knew that if I didn't write the stories out, if I didn't put them somewhere, then one day my own arms will fall to the forces of gravity and other circumstances. And so I sought out to become a writer.
Stan, what brought you into the writing profession?
If you want to go to the really mundane part, I was a dweeb. It was a very, very schizoid upbringing because on one hand, my parents wanted to be more white than the Caucasians, but they wanted me to be Japanese. And I'm going, well, what do you want? What do you want? You know? And so I learned to sit back and observe and be very quiet and only venture my opinion when it was required of me or demanded actually of me. There was a quote, and I should have gotten the actual quote, but it was somebody in the Guardian English newspaper that said, poetry is the new journalism. If you want truth, with the media becoming more and more split and more confrontational, it's the arts and the artists that are really speaking the truth. So if you want truth, go see a Basquiat exhibition. If you want truth, read any number of poets. If you want truth, listen to, well, Bob Dylan, you know. And so more and more, it is the artists that are really speaking truth.
That's going to give me a lot to think about. Thank you for sharing that with us. Kalia, did your family talk openly about the violence and discrimination they experienced, or was that topic similar to Stanley's family, more taboo?
Unlike Stanley's family, because I had been born in the camps, because in this place where I was born, there were too many children and not enough schools, I couldn't go to school. And so I grew up listening to the stories of the adults around me, Jarren. It was their way of breaking open the walls of the camp. Grandma would tell me about life beyond the river, up high in the mountains, where the cloud rested across the valley like belts. You know, it was a way of envisioning and opening up my world. And I think PTSD was rampant in this camp. And so they needed to talk. And who better to talk to than a child who listens with wide open eyes? When we came to America, there was no way that my mom and dad could protect me from the racism of the world that we were in. Similarly to our entrance into the camp, our entrance into Minnesota, we were the biggest wave of refugees to enter the country, 1987. And so when we came, there was a lot of talk about who the Hmong were, whether we ate dogs or not. The newspapers would talk about Hmong gardens being vandalized. And I'd hear stories from the adults and the children alike of the racism that they faced. In my own life, I had to battle the same forces. You know, Christmas was Toys for Tots. Thanksgiving was Meals on Wheels. We weren't just refugees. We were poor people here in America. So Mom and Dad were sent to the factories where their bosses said, you're here to talk to the machines, not to us. At the grocery store, my mother stood with WIC vouchers in her hands to make sure that we would have egg and milk and bread. And everybody would say, oh no, again, she's going to take too long. People shifted lines around us. And I watched my mother stand with her head so high. And my father, because like you, Stanley, he's a poet, with his poet's heart trembling by the door, waiting for an exit. But my mother stood there in all of those lines, and I stood with her. Because I knew that while I could not protect her any more than she could protect us, at least we were together in it. So yeah, no way of hiding poverty. You know, I went to Carleton College, and I remember going with this torn jacket and feeling so self-conscious. The whole semester I was there, I wrapped my right hand around this hole, thinking that other people were going to see. And then realizing rich people don't notice the tear in other people's clothing.
Kalia, how has your family reacted to you sharing their stories so publicly?
Courageously. You know, I began my first book as a 22-year-old. By the time I was 27, The Late Homecomer had made its way into the world. And I wrote that book for my grandmother, Joa Lee, who never learned how to read or write. Her biggest fear was that she would be forgotten. And I saw myself how in her older days, how her memories grew wings and they flew far away from her. And so I wanted to write all of the things that I didn't want to forget about my grandma down. I thought I was writing a memoir of her life. I did not understand then that I was documenting the history of a people, that it was my own history that I was chasing. My grandma wasn't here to give me her blessing, but I received news that I would be fully funded in my journey into the MFA program on the day that we buried my grandmother. Grandma was a shaman, a medicine woman, and a healer, and she always practiced big magic. And so I felt like that was her way of saying, go, Minai, chase your dreams.
Kalia, do you feel like writing is helping you and your family and your community?
That is such a good question, Jarren. I think about it all the time. You know, this year I'll have 4 new books out. And so in many ways, my journey as a writer will be pushed much further than it's been. And I think about the question with every book that comes out. You know, is my writing of service not only to me, but my family and my community? You know, just today I read 13 different student letters, students who are studying somewhere in the unknown world and talking about the ways in which they now understand the diversity that lives here in Minnesota so much more because of my work. That somewhere in the unknown world, the book that they're studying is a collective memoir of 15 different refugee stories from around the world, from wars the last 100 years, all gathered here. When I think about something like that, I think I did it. There is no more mountains to climb. But then surviving as an artist, Stanley, as you were speaking to earlier, is a very challenging thing. And for me, it has always been my main gig. I was 22 when I set out on the journey. I'm now 43, and it is the only thing that I've passionately and persistently pursued. And so when I think about how hard it is for me, but also my family, for my mom and dad to watch me struggle. You know, oftentimes, Jarren, when I'm invited into a room, I'm the first one there. That looks like me, that sounds like me. You know, when I'm on a stage, I am the one whose feet are too short to touch the floor, so they dance in the air, when everybody else is sitting with so much, you know, grace and comfort. That is me. I remember one time I gave a talk at Brigham Young University, and my mom and dad had both gone with me. I did the keynote in the gymnasium. There were 30,000 students, and I looked up, and my mom and dad were there. And my dad said that in all of his life, he had never been so afraid for me. And my mom said she felt the same fear. The work that I do not only necessitates that I have a courageous heart, but that those who love me most, that they too must be brave. I walk through the world, my father says, with a sword. I don't use a shield. It is because of their love. It is because of their steadfast belief in the work that I do that allows me to live and do this kind of work in the world. When I read in front of my community, elders come up and they say, that is my story that you are telling. There is so much responsibility that I carry because I'm one of the first, because I'm one of the most recognized and acknowledged Hmong American writers working at the moment. And I try to do that the best I can, knowing that all I can do is the best I can do. But that question that you asked is a question that I think I will ask myself forever. How can I not?
And I think for both of you, there are probably choruses of people in your lives, strangers, silently screaming like, yes, you're helping so many people beyond even what you're aware of. There are just so many people in so many ways grateful for what you're doing. We know that recently there has been an increase in violence directed toward people of color and particularly immigrants, which I'm sure has impacted you and your families. In what ways has that increase potentially impacted your writing and your creativity and your process?
I think both of us probably take it very personally, but it has also, from the personal, it expands out. And so it is no longer just the Japanese Americans. It is no longer just Asians. I have a poem where I said, my mom shivers every time someone says the other, you, foreigner. She was so upset when the prisons were opened in Guantanamo Bay. It's more than just our familial experience now. It is anytime there is injustice done against a people. I feel like I must speak out, even if that makes me controversial or unpopular, or people question where I'm coming from. It is what I'm called to do. It is the responsibility, I think, of all of us as artists to speak truth, especially in these times when there is so much untruth.
I completely agree, Stanley. And, particularly in light of COVID-19, the pandemic, the instances of Asian American hate in this country increased, disproportionately. Elders are getting beaten on the streets, here in Minnesota and, California, New York, all across the place. With my parents being elders now, there is a great deal of a fear for them. They hesitate into English. They slip and they fall into the language. When people look at them, especially the Hmong in these parts, everybody knows Hmong people are refugees at a time when wars are being waged around the world. And that we're creating more and more refugees every second. The question is, how many more can we take of you? And what do you do for our country? Once at a gas station, somebody said that out loud to my dad. My dad and I were there and they said, what are people like you doing here in this country? You're doing nothing but weighing us down. My dad had a handful of coins in his hands and he shook, he trembled, and the coins fell, Stanley. And I went onto the ground and my dad and I were picking up those coins and the man spat, then walked out. And in the car, my father said to me, he looked at me, he said, I have nothing more to give this country. I have nothing more to give this country. I'm giving them you all. What else is there? And so when I think about the instances of Asian American hate across this country, we live in the state that has murdered George Floyd. I just saw the home ownership disparities between people of color, BIPOC communities, and the white majority in this state is the biggest across all of the United States of America. While we're home to more refugees per capita than any other state in the nation, we have to contend with all of these other things that we are. Jarren, when I speak here, I'm a Hmong American author. The moment I leave Minnesota behind, people look at me and they say, Kao Kalia, the Minnesota author. I come from one of the most literary states in the nation. I don't become an American writer until I leave America's borders. Then people look at the way I talk, the way I eat, the way I walk, and they say, she's American. I live in a very intersectional body. I'm a tiny, tiny woman. I'm a mother, I'm a wife. I'm all of these things, and I interface in the world in all of these capacities and these roles. And so in each thing that I do, I think to myself, because I believe it, how do I live in such a way where I am not just a character? How do I live in such a way that I'm not just passing by somebody's life? How do I become the best possible character that I can be? Tonight, Jarren, to you, to Stanley, to Charlotte, who's not speaking but listening to us, how do I be the best character I can be in the book of your lives? And that question guides me in who I am from a spiritual place, but also from a creative space. I couldn't do the work that I do and live in the state at this time without thinking that, oh my God, maybe I can make somebody's story a little bit better because we've chanced upon each other.
Friends for a Nonviolent World's work involves addressing violence and using nonviolent methods to achieve positive social change. How do you see art in general, and perhaps your writing in particular, as intersecting with these goals?
Oh gosh, it's everything, is it not, Kalia?
It is everything, yes.
Tell me more.
Here's one lesson I learned as a writer. When I started writing, I thought I need to write very general because then everyone would understand it. And it's the exact opposite. The more specific, the more details, the more inside your head you can get, the more people will respond because they don't have your experience. But they will connect it with, oh, I remember my great-grandmother's story. I remember my uncle's story. And so you're collecting all these threads together and weaving a new cloth, so to speak. And so I think the importance of writers and artists is to get that personal experience and tie it into this greater cloth of the whole. And it's when you have this whole cloth of truth, it's very, very hard to make untruths real, because you have this almost tangible tapestry of lives and experience and ultimate truth that you can't deny that.
Can you give me an example, Stan?
I can give an example. I think I know exactly what Stanley is referring to. You know, in the refugee camps of Thailand, we had a few hungry chickens, a few hungry dogs, but there were no tigers. Through my grandmother's stories, the tigers visited me in the dark beneath the shining moon. You know, and the tiger could talk, and the tiger could walk, and it could perform real magic. I didn't meet my first tiger until we came here at Como Zoo, Jarren, and that tiger was a tiger whose magic I could no longer feel. The art had prepared me in some ways for that meeting. That meeting didn't live up to the thing that was happening in my head, but it fueled my heart. All of my life, I wanted to write a story about a tiger who's lost his magic. The story itself becomes seeds of inspiration in my own heart. Growing up on the east side of St. Paul in our falling down house where the wall grew wild with mold. In the depths of winter, my father would point and say, "What do you see on the canvas around you?" And my brothers and sisters and I would evoke the Chinese paintings that we'd seen on television. We point to a tree growing on the edge of a cliff where the wind blew so fast and the ocean called so hard. The world around us became the world. My father's always said, "You are not poor children because your hearts are not poor places." It became those sights of possibility deep within. My father's a poet like Stanley, and he is. You know, his poetry shielded me from the poverty of my life, Jarren. Where else do you have a kid who gets one of the best education that money can buy, Carleton and then Columbia, and she gets to do this kind of work in the world, where she gets to say, "Our stories matter. They brought me here to you. You matter to me and I matter to you, and we belong only because we belong to each other." Art allows me to say that in a world that is so divisive, a world divided by borders and nation states. Art breaks away those walls. It allows me to travel beyond the confines of my body. I'm only 4'10", and my boys, when they were 5 years old, saw me in the mix of mothers, and they said, "Oh my God, we have a small mother." It hadn't occurred to them that I was small right up until that moment. And I looked at them and they said, "Mama, your body is small, but your spirit is so large." Art makes that possible. Without art, I would be a very, very tiny woman with a very tiny voice that wouldn't carry anywhere. And art allows me to build possibilities in the world, possibilities for beauty, for growth, for togetherness, for unity. So art is everything, Stanley.
Yes, it is. It is. I love the story about the tiger at Como Zoo. You couldn't feel its spirit. It wasn't a tiger. It was a caged tiger. It was a tiger in captivity. It wasn't in its natural element. So, of course, you would not feel that, because it was a tiger in captivity, just as my family was, just as your family was.
Exactly. So we know what it is like to be held in cages. You know, one of my picture books coming out in May is called Caged. And it's called Caged, but on the picture, there are children flying free. Cages cannot hold us in. The human spirit is that amazing. We look at the diary of Anne Frank. We look at the experiences of people like the Japanese American or the Jewish people all around the world. You know, and there are populations in every single country that's being persecuted. We look at all of that, and I know that there's no cage that can hold back the human spirit. You know, when the Central Intelligence Agency came to the high mountains of Laos to ask the Hmong men to fight and to die on America's behalf, we were a secret because they never thought that a writer like me would emerge of all places from the American heartland, Jarren. That is incredible. You know, I say the impossible happens in the life of the refugee every single day. The impossible happens in my life every single day.
So correct me if I'm wrong, but it sounds like art and specifically writing has provided both of you some sense of outlet and a freedom for your spirits to grow and show themselves, right? Like your spirit can show itself to the world through art. Have you, or maybe other artists you've known, also had experiences where art has specifically impacted nonviolence?
Art and writing not only gives us a voice, it gives us power. It gives us disenfranchised people a franchise. It gives us an entree into the bigger society. And so when I read a poem, inevitably someone, usually a Caucasian, will come and say, I had no idea about this. But my wife's podiatrist is Latino. She was talking about what was going on, and this person got visibly angry. It's like, how could that happen in the United States? In other words, she was buying into this myth, this perception of the United States as being all holy, all benevolent, all wonderful for everybody, all inclusive. And to have that image shattered, it was like having your father tell you a lie and you uncovering it. And so when that happens, of course, that's going to change your way of thinking about America and about who's telling the history, whose history is it, and if that was left out, what other things have been left out.
I also wonder, too, if hearing that history or hearing that truth by way of poetry or art is also almost like an easier pill to swallow, is to hear it from someone who has a story and a connection and such raw feelings, because you really can connect with people's stories.
You know, Jarren, your question makes me think about the incident that happened in Barron County. So we all know there have been a series of hunting tragedies in the woods. So in Barron County, Kaishua who was hunting, he had shot several white men, hunters. And that was a big thing. I was the first writer invited to go back to the university there to do a common book. And when I went back, my mom and she had driven out with me because she felt it would not be safe. We passed by cars with, stickers saying, kill a Hmong, save a deer. And when I donned the university keynote, it was full of students who read my book, who were engaging with me and talking about the diversity that lives there. When I did the library portion of it, which usually not a lot of writers go, so these library events are generally well attended. There were 4 old women. And when I got up, they said, don't even bother to speak. We only came here because we wanted to see what a Hmong person looked like. The professor was there, and my mom looked at me, and I looked down, and then I looked at them, and I said, well, I am Hmong, and I am here. Pose that as a question so we can go somewhere. By the time I was done speaking, they were all crying, Jarren, and they asked for hugs. I've been in so many places across the state where the first event I go to, there's one random person who comes and looks to see who I am. The second event, about 50 miles later, there's 20 people in the room. The next event is standing room only. And they're here because there are truths that we're sharing, as Stanley has noted. But also, I think, because we're not what they expected. The seed of stereotypes, the seed of racism, the seed of hate there are assumptions and presumptions about what we know. When people come to Kao Kalia Yang events, they think maybe I'll learn more about the Hmong. No artist, no matter where they're writing from, is limited by anything. It is the pulse of humanity that I'm trying to feel. If I'm talking about kissing my grandmother, her damp skin, if you've ever kissed your grandmother, you know exactly how that feels like. If I'm talking about looking at a balding man who smiles and somehow makes the world young again, if you've ever seen Love, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It is the human experience that we write of. My daddy said to me once, after a teacher said, oh, do you get discriminated on because of the work you do? Because you're like 30 and you're unmarried and you're traveling across the country by yourself. And in the car, my dad said to me, I don't understand everything, but did she ask you what it is like to be my daughter? And I said, kind of. He looked at me and he said, remember this. The work you would do will go beyond your gender. It will go beyond your people. It is for a greater humanity. Continually, I think we are boxed in. We are expected to play certain roles. But the number one comment I get when I speak, when I read, when I engage with a public is, you are not what I expected. You are not what I expected. What did you expect? It's that process of introspection and reflection, I think, that builds a more understanding world. Every writer knows that we're not trying to win your agreement or disagreement. We are here to deepen your understanding of the human experience. We're there to explore our own experience of what it's like to be human. And so, no, if they learn a little bit more about the Hmong, I haven't succeeded. If they learn a little bit more about the internment camps, Stanley hasn't succeeded. We succeed when they walk out there feeling the fragility of the human experience and knowing that we belong because we belong together. That is really the heart of what we do.
Yeah, and when you shatter expectations, then people are forced to see you as a human being, not as Hmong, not as Japanese, not as Jewish, not as Lebanese. When people can see the humanity, then that's where real change can happen.
Speaking of shattering expectations, Kalia, this past year, you broadened your resume by writing the libretto for an opera based on your book, The Sound Poet. The Minnesota Opera premiered this piece in 2023. How did this come about?
I wrote a book called The Song Poet, and that book was read by Jamie Andrews, who used to work for the Minnesota Opera. Jamie said that when he read my first book, The Late Homecomer, he thought, this is the stuff of great opera. Then when he read The Song Poet, he goes, this should live as an opera. And so one day I got an email from Jamie Andrews. We met, and the idea was then that it would be a youth opera. And I'm like, oh, so exciting. They were going to bring in a New York librettist to write the libretto because I have no training. I've only been to a handful of operas in my life, and I am not ashamed to say most of the time I fall asleep. And so I wasn't trained for that particular craft and didn't feel equipped to do it. But during the pandemic, the vision for the opera changed. It was going to now become a main stage production. And I knew that it would be the first time a Hmong story is translated for the operatic stage. And then the New York librettist fell through. And so the question was, who would write the libretto? And people were waiting. And I thought to myself, Jarren, if I don't do it, if I say no, then some other child somewhere growing up on the poor side of town, they would never feel ready. I have to say yes. And I have to do the best I can. And that's got to prove something to me and to the world. And so I said, if you open up your process to me, if I can study your operas, not just what's on stage, but what happens before and after, then yeah, I'll do it. And so I did. And it was a historic production. It's the first time a Minnesota opera main stage production has sold out 6 months before premiere date. It was a historical production because it was the first time that Minnesota Opera had commissioned a work by a female librettist, a female composer, on the same project. And so there's a lot to celebrate about that experience. And I've learned an incredible truth. Simply because we've never been exposed, simply because we've never had the opportunity, does not mean that we cannot do something.
I think you've proven that. Stan, you also navigated a multifaceted career, including roles as a teacher, poet, writer, arts advocate, and musician. How do you manage all of that?
I don't know that it's a sense of managing, per se. I do have a very understanding wife, which helps. I get to say, oh, I need to do this now. Or at 3:00 in the morning, I need to go write. It's in my head, I got to go. I'm the benefactor of a very, very generous mate in life. But managing, you just do it. And I don't think it's a question of do I have time or how do I organize? This needs to come out now. This needs to come out as music. This needs to come out as writing. This needs to come out as instruction with kids. It all seems to work. It's not that I'm trying to duck the question, but I think it's very, very organic. I don't separate everything into, okay, now I'm going to be a musician. Oh, now I'm a teacher. Now you have to be, especially as a teacher, you have to be all of those things at once because the kids respond to someone who comes at them as a whole individual. Not as, oh, now I'm a teacher. Then they go, oh, he's in teacher mode. Okay, we can tune out. But if you come in, yes, I'm teaching you, but I'm coming from a musician. I'm coming from a poet. I'm coming from someone who does theatrical stuff. Then they're kind of going, okay, that means something to me. I can engage with that.
Absolutely. It's that intersectionality that Kalia was talking about earlier. Kalia, If our listeners haven't read any of your work, where would you suggest they start?
I think they should start with the picture books. I think the sensibility of a writer does not change in accordance with audience. I think the subject matter sometimes does, but picture books are always to me an immediate gift. And so I'd say start gentle with the picture books and work your way up. Where Rivers Part is the longest of my memoirs. It is my 5th book for adults, but I have 6 for children. I have 3 more by year's end. So you have lots of choice.
And I also would like to add that the illustrations in your children's books are just phenomenal.
Thank you. The artists are so talented.
You're welcome.
I feel so blessed that they're holding up the other end of the pole, that I only get to do the word part of it.
Kalia, Stanley, it has been so informative and enjoyable to spend this time with you. I can't thank you enough. I'm Jarren Peterson Dean, and I've been speaking with Kao Kalia Yang and Stanley Kusunoki. More information about our guests can be found in the program notes, which includes links to their websites, www.kaokaliayang.com and www.poetteacher.com. Thank you both so much.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you. It's such an honor to be on here with you, Stanley. And thank you, Jarren, for being such a gracious host.
And the honor is mine as well, Kalia.
Thank you for listening to Everyday Nonviolence. To learn more about Friends for a Nonviolent World, visit our website at fnvw.org or call 651-917-0383. We hope you will subscribe so that you don't miss future episodes and insightful conversations. Please note that the views expressed in this podcast are those of the host and guest and are not intended to reflect the official positions of FNVW, its staff, or board of directors.